The rifle cracked 10 times in rapid succession, each shot finding its mark with mechanical precision. 10 rounds, 10 targets, 10 perfect hits at distances that had defeated an entire squad of trained Marines all morning. The shooting range fell silent. 200 yards away, the paper silhouettes that had mocked a dozen young shooters now hung in tatters, each one bearing a single hole dead center in the kill zone. The man who had fired those shots lowered the rifle slowly, his weathered hands steady as stone, his eyes still fixed downrange with the focus of a predator. He was wearing clothes that should have been thrown away years ago. His beard was unkempt, his hair unwashed, his boots held together with electrical tape. 5 minutes earlier, these same Marines had been laughing at him. Now none of them could speak. If this story reminds you that skill never fades, and heroes walk among us unrecognized, comment "respect" below. The morning had started badly for 2nd Squad, 3rd Platoon. Their unit had been assigned to the Camp Pendleton rifle range for quarterly qualification, a routine exercise that every Marine was expected to pass without difficulty. But something had gone wrong. Shooter after shooter had stepped up to the firing line, taken careful aim, and missed. Not by inches, but by feet. Rounds that should have found centre mass were sailing wide, punching holes in dirt berms and empty air, while the targets stood untouched and mocking. Sergeant Victor Reyes had watched his squad fail with growing frustration, unable to identify the problem. These were good Marines. They had qualified expert on their previous assessments. They knew how to shoot. But today, something was fundamentally broken, and nobody could figure out what. The squad had been given a 2-hour break, while the range safety officers investigated a possible equipment malfunction. Rather than sit around the barracks dwelling on their failure, Reyes had loaded his men into a transport van and driven them to a small coffee shop just outside the base perimeter. The Copper Kettle was a local institution, a place where generations of Marines had come to decompress over strong coffee and mediocre pastries. The walls were covered with military memorabilia, photographs of units stretching back to Korea, and the owner was a retired gunnery sergeant who understood that sometimes young warriors needed a place to feel normal for an hour. Reyes and his squad occupied 3 tables near the back, their conversation a mixture of frustration and disbelief.
"I'm telling you, Sergeant, something's wrong with those rifles," said Lance Corporal Danny Morrison, a 22-year-old from Texas who had grown up hunting deer and could usually outshoot half the platoon. "I had perfect sight picture, perfect trigger pull, and my rounds were going 3 feet left. That's not me. That's the weapon." Private First Class Angela Torres shook her head, stirring her coffee with aggressive frustration. "It's not just the weapons. I watched Chen miss by 4 feet high. 4 feet, at 200 yards. That's not a scope problem, that's a physics problem." The debate continued around the tables, theories multiplying without resolution. Bad ammunition, defective scopes, atmospheric conditions, sabotage by a rival squad as a prank. Each explanation was offered and dismissed, leaving the fundamental mystery intact. How had an entire squad of qualified Marines suddenly forgotten how to shoot? None of them noticed the old man sitting alone in the corner booth until he stood up and walked toward their tables. He moved with a slight limp, favouring his left leg, but there was something in his bearing that suggested the injury was old and long accommodated. His clothes were the uniform of the displaced, layers of worn fabric that had seen too many winters and not enough washing machines. His face was a roadmap of hard years, weathered and lined, with eyes that seemed to look through things rather than at them. He stopped at the edge of their cluster of tables and waited until the conversation paused. "Couldn't help but overhear," he said. His voice was quiet but carried an unexpected authority, the kind of voice accustomed to being listened to. "You're having scope problems at the range." Sergeant Reyes looked up with barely concealed irritation. The last thing he needed right now was some homeless guy offering unsolicited advice about Marine Corps weapons systems. "We've got it handled, sir. Thanks for your concern." The old man nodded slowly, as if he had expected exactly this response. "I'm sure you do, but if your rounds are consistently going left at 200 yards and high at the same distance from different shooters, you've probably got a batch of scopes that weren't properly cold zeroed. The adjustment turrets are slipping under recoil. I could recalibrate them for you if you'd let me take a look." The laughter started with Morrison, a sharp bark of disbelief that spread quickly through the squad. "Did you hear that? Homeless guy wants to fix our rifles." He turned to face the old man with a grin that held no warmth.
No offense, Pops, but I don't think the Marine Corps needs shooting advice from someone who can't even afford a razor. The old man's expression did not change. He simply stood there, absorbing the mockery with the patience of someone who had endured far worse. No offense taken, but the offer stands. Those scopes won't fix themselves, and your qualification scores are going to suffer until someone addresses the problem. Torres leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, studying the old man with open skepticism. Okay, I'll bite. Let's say we take you back to the range. Let's say we hand you a rifle. What exactly do you think you're going to do that a squad of trained Marines couldn't? The old man met her gaze without flinching. Hit the target. The challenge hung in the air like a lit fuse. Reyes should have shot it down immediately. Taking a civilian onto an active military range was a paperwork nightmare at best, a career-ending decision at worst. But something in the old man's certainty nagged at him. There was no bluster in his claim, no bravado, just a simple statement of fact, delivered with the quiet confidence of someone who had nothing to prove and nothing to lose. Against his better judgment, Reyes made a decision he would remember for the rest of his life. All right, old-timer, you want to show us how it's done? Let's see what you've got. The squad erupted in excited chatter as they gathered their gear and headed for the van. This was going to be entertaining, if nothing else. A homeless man making a fool of himself on a Marine Corps rifle range. The story would be legendary in the barracks for months. The range was quiet when they returned, the other units still on break, the firing lanes empty except for the targets that had defeated them all morning. Reyes checked in with the range safety officer, spinning a story about a civilian consultant that was thin enough to tear, but apparently convincing enough to pass. The old man was issued ear protection and led to the firing line, where a standard M27 infantry automatic rifle waited on the shooting bench. He picked it up with a familiarity that made Morrison's smile falter slightly. The way he checked the chamber, the way his hands found the grip and the stock, the way he shouldered the weapon and sighted down range without a moment of hesitation. These were not the movements of a novice. These were the movements of someone who had held a rifle 10,000 times before. 200 yards, Reyes said, gesturing toward the distant targets. 10 rounds. Let's see what you can do. The old man did not respond. He was already settling into position, his breathing slowing, his body becoming unnaturally still. The squad watched in silence, their mockery fading as they recognized something they had not expected to see. This man knew what he was doing. The first shot cracked across the range, and the target 200 yards away shuddered. Through his binoculars, Reyes saw the hole appear dead center in the silhouette's chest. A perfect hit. The second shot followed 2 seconds later, same result. Then the third, the fourth, the fifth. Each round found its mark with surgical precision, grouping so tight that the holes nearly overlapped. By the 7th shot, no one was laughing anymore. By the 10th, they were barely breathing. The old man lowered the rifle and turned to face the stunned Marines. Your scopes aren't broken, but whoever zeroed them didn't account for the temperature differential between the armory and the outdoor range. Cold metal contracts, the reticle shifts. You need to let the weapons acclimate for at least 30 minutes before firing, or re-zero them on sight. He set the rifle down on the bench with the casual ease of a craftsman returning a tool to its proper place. Also, your trigger discipline is sloppy. Half of you are anticipating the recoil and pulling left. The other half are holding your breath too long and drifting high. Fundamentals matter more than equipment. Reyes stared at the old man as if seeing him for the first time. Who the hell are you? Before the old man could answer, a voice cut across the range from the observation tower. Sweet mother of God! Is that who I think it is? Reyes turned to see Master Gunnery Sergeant William Porter descending the tower stairs with an expression of pure disbelief. Porter was a legend at Camp Pendleton, a 30-year veteran who had served in every conflict from Grenada to Afghanistan and who currently ran the Scout Sniper School with an iron fist and a surgeon's precision. He was also the last person Reyes wanted to see right now, given the unauthorized civilians standing at his firing line. But Porter was not looking at Reyes. He was not looking at the squad, or the rifles, or the targets. He was looking at the old homeless man, with something that looked almost like reverence. Staff Sergeant Thomas Avery, Porter said, stopping 10 feet away. Call sign, Ghost. 3 tours in Vietnam. Confirmed kills in triple digits. The man who held the Marine Corps distance record for 17 years until some kid with a 50 cal and a computer finally beat it. He shook his head slowly, as if struggling to process what he was seeing. I studied your shot placements at Khe Sanh when I was in sniper school. We all did. You're a goddamn legend. What in God's name are you doing here? The old man, Thomas Avery, Ghost, legend, looked at Porter with eyes that held decades of memory. Living, he said simply. Same as anyone. The story that emerged over the following hours would reshape how every Marine present understood the cost of service. Thomas Avery had enlisted in 1966, at the age of 18, driven by a patriotism that was simple and sincere. He had shown an extraordinary aptitude for marksmanship from his first day at the rifle range, a natural gift that his instructors quickly recognized and cultivated. By 19, he was a scout sniper. By 20, he had accumulated more confirmed kills than men twice his age. His ability to disappear into the landscape and strike from impossible distances earned him the call sign Ghost, a name whispered with fear by enemy commanders and with awe by his fellow Marines. He had served 3 tours in Vietnam, each one leaving marks that did not show on the surface. He had done things that his country asked him to do, things that were necessary and brutal and impossible to forget. When he finally came home in 1972, he was 24 years old and already ancient in ways that no one could see. The transition back to civilian life had been a slow-motion catastrophe. The skills that had made him invaluable in war were useless in peace. The instincts that had kept him alive in the jungle made him a stranger in his own country. He could not sleep without seeing faces. He could not hear a car backfire without reaching for a weapon that was no longer there. The VA had been overwhelmed with returning veterans, their resources stretched beyond breaking, and Thomas had fallen through the cracks like so many others. His marriage had collapsed under the weight of silence he could not break. His attempts at employment had failed as the flashbacks grew worse. By 1980, he was living on the streets, another invisible casualty of a war that America was trying desperately to forget. He had been homeless, with brief interruptions, for over 40 years. He had watched the country change around him, watched new wars begin and end, watched generations of young men and women march off to conflicts that echoed the one that had broken him. He had never asked for help. He had never sought recognition. He had simply survived, day by day, carrying the weight of what he had done and what had been done to him with the same quiet endurance that had made him a legend in the jungles of Southeast Asia. The rifle range today had been an accident. He had been walking past the base perimeter when he heard the distant crack of gunfire, a sound that still called to something deep in his bones. He had followed that sound to the coffee shop, where he had sat nursing a cup of coffee purchased with his last few dollars, listening to young Marines struggle with a problem he could solve in his sleep. The response from the Marine Corps was swift and comprehensive. Master Gunnery Sergeant Porter made phone calls that reached all the way to the Commandant's office. Within 48 hours, Thomas Avery was being processed through the Veterans Administration with the kind of priority that had been denied to him for decades. His service record, long buried in classified archives, was retrieved and reviewed. His medals, including a Silver Star and 2 Bronze Stars that he had never bothered to claim, were prepared for presentation. A team of specialists was assigned to address the physical and psychological wounds that had gone untreated for more than 40 years. But the most immediate change came from the squad that had laughed at him in the coffee shop. Lance Corporal Morrison had approached Thomas the day after the range incident, his earlier mockery replaced by something that looked like shame. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I looked at you and I don't know what I saw, but I didn't see a Marine. I didn't see a hero. I saw someone to make fun of so I could feel better about my own failures. That was wrong." Thomas had studied the young man for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "You're not the first. You won't be the last. The question isn't whether you judge people by their appearance. Everyone does. The question is whether you're willing to look again when you find out you're wrong." Morrison had extended his hand. "Would you teach us? Not just about the scopes, about all of it, about how you got so good, about how you survived what you survived, about how we can be better." The informal mentorship that followed would become legendary at Camp Pendleton. Thomas Avery, homeless veteran, forgotten legend, began spending his days at the rifle range, teaching young Marines the fundamentals of precision shooting and the philosophy that underpinned them. He taught them about patience, about stillness, about the meditative focus required to send a round across vast distances with perfect accuracy. He taught them about the weight of taking a life, about the responsibility that came with their skills, about the importance of remembering that every target downrange represented a choice that could never be unmade. He taught them about survival, not just in combat, but in the long years afterward, when the battles are over, but the war continues in the mind. The dedication ceremony was held 3 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, with the entire Scout Sniper School assembled in formation. Thomas Avery stood at attention in a new dress uniform, the medals he had earned half a century ago finally pinned to his chest. The Commandant of the Marine Corps himself had flown in to present the ceremony, recognising not just Thomas's historical service, but his contribution to the current generation of warriors. Staff Sergeant Avery represents everything the Marine Corps aspires to be, the Commandant said, his voice carrying across the parade ground. Skill, courage, dedication, and the willingness to serve, even after the uniform comes off, even after the nation has failed to serve him in return. His example reminds us that a Marine is not made by what he wears, but by what he carries in his heart. But it was the words of Sergeant Reyes, spoken at a smaller gathering that evening, that Thomas would carry with him for the rest of his days. 3 months ago, I sat in a coffee shop and watched my squad laugh at an old man who offered to help us. I almost sent him away. I almost let my assumptions about who he was prevent me from seeing what he was, and I would have missed the greatest teacher I've ever had. Reyes raised his glass toward Thomas. To Staff Sergeant Avery, Ghost, the man who taught us that expertise doesn't expire, that service doesn't end, and that the most valuable people in our lives are often the ones we almost overlooked. Thomas Avery spent his final years in a small apartment near Camp Pendleton, his rent covered by a combination of VA benefits and a fund established by the Marines he had trained. He continued teaching until his body would no longer allow it, passing on skills and wisdom to hundreds of young snipers who would carry his lessons into conflicts he would never see. He died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 76, surrounded by former students who had become family. His funeral was attended by over 1,000 Marines, a procession of dress uniforms stretching from the chapel to the cemetery, every one of them standing at attention as his casket passed. The inscription on his headstone was simple: Staff Sergeant Thomas Avery, Ghost. He never missed. There are men and women walking among us whose skills and service have been forgotten by the world. They wear the clothes of poverty rather than the uniforms they earned. They carry memories of valour that no one asks to hear. They watch younger generations struggle with problems they solved decades ago, and they wonder if they still have anything left to give. Thomas Avery spent 40 years as a ghost in a different sense than the one he had earned in Vietnam. He was invisible not because of stealth, but because society had stopped looking at people like him. It took a missed target and a moment of grace for a squad of young Marines to see what had been standing in front of them all along. A legend, a teacher, a hero. The next time you see someone that the world has dismissed, remember Thomas Avery. Remember that the hands holding a cardboard sign might once have held a rifle with perfect precision. Remember that the eyes avoiding your gaze might once have saved American lives from distances you cannot imagine. Remember that skill never fades, that service never expires, and that the people we overlook might be exactly the people we need. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that every veteran deserves to be seen, and that true excellence recognizes no uniform but the one worn in the heart.